Dear students, welcome you all for the first session of the second chapter of Financial Management 2 of Mangalore University. In this chapter, in this session, we are going to discuss working capital management and introduction. So my presentation will be first, I will introduce the session, then meaning of the working capital, the meaning of working capital management, and then I will discuss types of working capital management. This is the learning objective of the entire chapter and also this session. So objective is to understand working capital management and prepare statement of working capital. The outcome of the session is the student will be able to understand working capital management, its concept, and also they will be able to prepare a statement of working capital for any given organization. Now let us come to the introduction. Capital. So capital is required for any business to set up. Without capital, we cannot think of setting up a business. And after setting up a business, then it is required to run the business and to meet the short-term and long-term objective of the business. So capital is required. Capital requirement can be either long-term and short-term. So long-term, why long-term? Because to meet the long-term goals of the business. So what are the long-term goals of the business? It could be expansion of the business, it could be modernization of the business, it could be purchase of new assets to the business, or it could be introducing new line of business. Then also there is a requirement of short-term. So what is the short-term capital? Why it is required? So it is required to meet day-to-day operations of the business. So what is this day-to-day operations? That means daily production, that is conversion of raw material into work in progress into finished goods and up to the sales to the final consumer. So to do all this activity, the organization requires short-term capital and mainly to meet the day-to-day expenses of the business. So they should have some capital or money to pay the expenses. Then short-term capital is also known as working capital. So we are going to discuss what is working capital and what is working capital management. So meaning of working capital. So the meaning is there in the word itself. Working capital means it is a capital required to work, capital required to produce, capital required to convert the operatings or convert the raw materials into finished goods up to the sales point. So here there's a meaning of working capital. What it says that it is a capital that is found excess when you compare the current assets over the current liabilities. In other words, so working capital refers to the excess of current assets over the current liabilities. So current assets mean what? So current assets means those assets which can be converted into cash within a period of 1 year. So that means within 1 year you can convert that asset into cash, or it can be converted into liquid form. For example, raw material, stock, inventory, debtors, bills receivable, etc. Then current liabilities. So those liabilities can be also said as obligations which need to be paid within 1 year. So that means short-term loans, short-term obligations which has to be paid. For example, payment to supplier, payment to loan repayment to short-term credit, all these things. So this is the meaning of working capital. Now let us go to the next one, meaning of working capital management. So what is working capital management? We have understood what is working capital. Next comes the management part. So what is that? So it refers to a set of activities performed by a company. So management means there are a lot of activities performed by the officers, different levels of managers. So all these activities performed by a company to make sure it has got enough resources to meet day-to-day operational expenses. So that is what I said in the introduction part. So working capital management is nothing but, so you should have enough resources in the form of current assets to meet the current liabilities or obligations. So that is called as working capital management. So there should not be any gap or there should not be any shortage of resources or shortage of current assets. If there is any shortage of current assets, then you are not managing your working capital well. So there should be always excess of current assets over current liabilities. Then we can say that the company is managing its working capital well. Then, so it also involves liquidity management, accounts receivable management, inventory management, accounts payable management, short-term debt management. Now let us understand and discuss types of working capital. So what are the various types of working capital? The first one, gross working capital. The meaning is there in the word itself, gross. So gross means it is gross working capital or gross of current assets, or it is total of current assets. Then net working capital. Then we have permanent working capital. Then we have temporary working capital. Now let us discuss each one. First one, gross working capital. As I already said, the meaning of gross working capital, it is nothing but excess of current assets or total of all the current assets, or it is nothing but total of all current assets is known as gross working capital. So current assets are those which can be converted into cash within a financial year or within a year. So it includes, as I already said, debtors, inventories, bill receivable, short-term securities. So these are all various current assets. So gross working capital is nothing but total of all current assets. Now let us go to the net working capital. So when you deduct the current liabilities from the current assets, then you get the net working capital. So gross working capital is current assets, deduct the current liabilities, you will get the net working capital. So it is a difference between current assets and current liabilities. So it is the ability of the company to meet the operating expenses and current liabilities. So that means company is completely able. That means even if there are so many expenses, after meeting such expenses, they have excess capital. So that is net working capital. Now, what is permanent working capital? The meaning is again there in the word itself, permanent. So that is required for the organization throughout, which can also be said as minimum working capital that should be there with the company for at least 1 year. So that is permanent working capital. So let's go to the meaning. So minimum amount of current assets which are kept by a firm for entire year for smooth running of business operation is known as permanent working capital. So that will remain permanent, that will not be touched. So also called as regular working capital. So that is fixed working capital. So these are the other words which describe regular working capital or fixed working capital. That means it is fixed for the entire year. Now let us go to the temporary working capital. So what is temporary working capital? Now we already know what is permanent capital. So that is fixed. So over and above whatever you have is known as temporary capital. That means that is the capital which can be spent or which can be used to meet the obligations. So let's go to the meaning of temporary working capital. So the amount over and above permanent working capital is called as temporary working capital. That means you have foundation as fixed working capital or permanent working capital. Above that, whatever you spend is known as temporary working capital. So additional current assets to meet the fluctuations or changes in the business. For example, suddenly if there is anything urgency or anything problem which has occurred in the organization, or suddenly if you get larger order, to meet that fluctuations or to meet that contingency situation, whatever the capital you have is known as temporary working capital. So it is also called as variable working capital because it varies according to the situation, according to the contingencies. So that's all from this session. Thank you for watching this video.